I mention this because I'm coming from a social historical perspective. That's my background. A history buff, like Richard. We're both historians by nature and just by the fact that in order for me in my life to understand who God is, I have to know my history. Every history that I can pick up, I have to know. Because if the list is given to us in the book of Matthew from the prophets, if you go to them, they are historical cities and mappings. There is a trajectory of places that exist today that we can go and find out and do our due diligence. You know what I'm saying? So I want to start off with the book of Matthew and looking at it from a social historical lens of how it's outlined, right? So that means also looking at what was happening during the time of Jesus. I'm talking about the historical Jesus figure, correct? But then I also want to talk about the book of Acts. The book of Matthew is the synoptic gospels, right? Synoptic because they have a similar story, the similar narrative of Jesus being born and the crucifixion. There's a common narrative there. The book of John is not, because it's more theological. You know, it really just, you know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was totally different beginning narrative, right? But in the book of Acts, it becomes more social historical, right? We're talking about a time period when they started to develop churches. They started to develop a doctrine. This was a time period that after Jesus' ascension, it was like, okay, the last two things I'm going to leave you with is love God and love thy neighbor. That was the last two things that we left, right? And for me, when I think about Trinity, when I think about Father, Son, Holy Spirit, I'm thinking about the Spirit. He's making huge emphasis on that, on spirituality, and that I brought you my Son. That necessarily didn't work, but I'm going to pass on the next baton, which is the spirituality. And the reason I mention Acts is because I'm referring to Pentecost. And if you need a very brief refresher on the Pentecost, we're talking about the gathering of people, and that became the place where multiple languages were spoken. And this is kind of where I want to sort of stem off and have you kind of thinking the gospel according to hip hop. Because one of those languages was hip hop, right? And it's no wonder why, particularly, specifically in my research, when I'm talking about how many people embrace hip hop, Pentecostals are a huge supporter of hip-hop culture because they emphasize a lot of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So a lot of people look at, for example, freestyle as a form of speaking in tongues off of the dome, right? So there's a lot of like theological and spiritual parallelisms that could be made between hip-hop's aesthetics and how we do worship and develop our own church, which the Greek word is ecclesia, community, assembly and gathering of the people. So the hip-hop the gospel according to hip-hop. What is hip-hop? Because I can't really talk too much about the gospel of hip-hop without briefly talking about hip-hop. And this is how the gospel of hip-hop will start. It began by a prophet by the name of Africa Bambaataa, right? And he deemed the term, he got the term from one of his disciples called KRS-One, and he defined hip-hop as higher infinite power healing our people. Higher infinite power healing our people. Hip-hop. Why? What happened? What was happening? Again, I'm coming from a social historical perspective with a theological narrative, right? And when hip-hop came, it actually really didn't start in the Bronx. It actually started in Africa. So a gentleman by the name of Africa Bambaataa, who was the leader of one of the most notorious gangs in New York City called the Black Spades, won a contest that was sponsored by UNICEF, by the United Nations. And the winner, right, well, the contest was to write a letter about Africa. He won. A member of one of the biggest notorious gangs back in the 1970s won an essay contest to go to Africa. You got to let that sit in real quick. A dude from the hood won a contest to go to Africa. A lot of people know this, but not a lot of people know. But you see, when I meet up with Bam and interview him, I ask, well, Bam, what was it in Africa that you got so inspired to come back and transform this country and this world? I mean, Africa has always been the central piece of training and knowledge and wisdom. Even Jesus spent time in Egypt when he escaped with Joseph and Mary. As we know, one of the biggest prophets in our Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition is the Moses story, which stems off from Africa, right? He went to Africa and came back and met at the Bronx River Projects, right across the street where I used to work for an organization called Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice. And in this place, he gathered a lot of the gangs in New York City and told them that we're no longer going to do this. This is stupid. This is dividing and conquering our community. Let's stop this gang beef and change those knives for aerosol cans. Change those guns for microphones. And what began is what I like to call a social spiritual movement, part of this sort of legacy of community organizing. So getting back into my doctoral studies, my focus was on a doctorate of ministry, but my concentration was on transformational leadership and faith-rooted organizing. In other words, what Jesus was doing, what hip-hop was doing, what essentially Dorothy Day was doing, Dr. King was doing, they were doing faith-rooted organizing. They were organizing the community from a perspective of their faith and understanding. So they applied those same sort of Paul Alinsky tactics, if you will, from a more faith and theological context. So utilizing your resources, right, tangible and ideological, to mobilize the community, hence social spiritual movement. So during my doctoral studies, I did and emphasized a lot by studying these leaders, these movements, and what were they doing that were consistent and inconsistent with each other as well. So when hip-hop was being birthed, again, looking at it from a social historical perspective, I suggest you read The Power Broker by Robert Moses. Robert Moses played a huge part in the gentrification and allocation of many people in the Bronx because of the making of the highways, right?